Shabbat Shalom, everyone. This week's Torah portion is called Pinchas. Pinchas is often translated into English as Phineas. And if you've ever had a relative or a friend, someone you knew of, whose nickname was Pinky, that's because, in all likelihood, he was a Jewish man whose Hebrew name was Pinchas. We pick up the story of Pinchas at the very beginning of this week's portion for only about a paragraph. But it is a continuation almost in mid-paragraph or mid-sentence from last week's portion, where Pinchas, who is a Levite, sees a high-ranking Israelite consorting with a high-ranking Midianite woman, and he kills them both very impulsively, very suddenly. He reams them through. And this week's portion begins with the aftermath of that act, where God rewards Pinchas's righteousness and makes a breach shalom with him, a covenant of peace, of friendship. And this week's portion, this story of Pinchas, is really a very good example of how our tradition has always taken the Torah very seriously, even when we question its motives, when we question the actions of the people in the narrative, even to the point of disagreeing with them. And our tradition looks at Pinchas. The ancient rabbis say, well, if he had consulted them before he killed these two, they would have told him no. And if they had been around when he did it, they would have held him liable for capital punishment, because he knew, as a Levite, he knew better, and he knew the law. And so they have to grapple, these rabbis, and really every generation of commentators and scholars ever since, have to grapple with whether or not what Pinchas did was justifiable. Was this a crime of religious and spiritual passion? And if it was that justifiable? What were his motives? If his motives were pure, spiritually pure, love of God, if his motives were not because he had hatred in his heart for these two people, then maybe it was okay. Or maybe not. And it leads our tradition to a rather careful discussion and a lengthy discussion of capital punishment and of distinguishing between impulsive crimes of the moment and crimes that are what we would today call premeditated. But more than that, our tradition grapples with the issue of religious extremism, religious violence. And there is much to talk about, even if your passion in defending God, defending your faith, is pure in rabbi speak, even if it is worthy, is the violence itself worthy? Some interpret God's covenant of shalom with Pinchas as a way of constraining him from further violence. Now that he is brought into this covenant, he's got to think very carefully about how he will behave in defense of God, in defense of his faith. Some would say that religiously inspired violence is never okay. So we have this discussion, and it really has been a human discussion ever since. When is religious violence or religiously inspired violence, defense of the faith, when is that permissible, if ever? Our tradition is very careful not to give weight to that kind of passion, that we must obey the laws against murder, we must obey the laws against the taking of a human life. There are very, very few instances where taking another human life is justified, even in defense of God. Pinchas is rash. He is really someone who doesn't think twice. The modern, perhaps modern, um, sort of cliche about shoot first and ask questions later. This is Pinchas. And those later consequences can be quite dangerous. Now, the couple whom he kills happen to be, as I mentioned, high ranking. And some of our commentators say that it's not just that they were having an affair and that they were caught in the act, but that these were two people of high social standing, and the implications of what they were doing for the stability of community and for the spiritual security of the community were also at stake. But even so, religious violence is a problem. It is a problem then, 3,000 years ago. It is a problem today. When is that justified? It has been a problem throughout history that people will use religion, will use their faith, will use God as a way to justify or excuse violence against others whom they consider to be outsiders or sinners. We think of real panics like witch trials and burnings at the stake and even beheadings in the early modern period, done out of zeal, done out of this uncontrolled impulse. Mob action. These are the things that Pinchas's conduct gets at for our tradition. And he is a very stern warning, as we have interpreted it ever since, despite the fact that God makes a covenant with him. And it seems in the Torah portion itself that this is a good thing in God's judgment. Not so fast, says our tradition. Not so fast. Violence is violent. Violence inflicts harm in and of itself, and there are unanticipated consequences, especially violence in the name of faith. Pinchas must be remembered not as a hero, but as someone who needs to be controlled, and who someone is someone who our tradition says, not so, not so. This violence is not helpful. It is not considered or thought out. It's impulsive, it's rash. Pinchas is, for some, perhaps, an example of the lengths they will go to defend God and faith, but also an example of the damage and the lasting impact that an episode of violence can have. Now, the woman in question was a Midianite, and we have a long tradition in biblical literature of statements about the Midianites as enemies. And our tradition certainly asks if this princess, whose name was Cosby, um, was acting out of pure selfish lust, or was there something more important, something wider because she was a princess? Was there something about the Midianites that they put her in this position, or that she put herself in this position to do damage to the Israelites by having an affair with Zimri, who comes from a family of chieftains? There are other Midianite women, however, in our story, in the Bible, who have different reputations. Moses' wife Zipporah was a Midianite and the daughter of a priest. Ruth, the paradigm, the archetype of the true convert, was a Moabite, a neighboring tribe. We have these foreign women as part of our story. And we know that from these few examples that foreign women are a danger and that foreign women can be a blessing. It's interesting that there was a genetic study that showed that women married into Jewish cultures and refreshed our gene pool, but that women who married in stayed in. So we don't know what would have happened with Zimri and Cosby. But we do know that Pinchas's rash, impulsive murder has grave consequences because it opens the door to behavior that leads to chaos. And if the Torah is about nothing else, it is about finding order, holy order, in a world of chaos, of creating stable and healthy communities for the good of all. So we read Pinchas's story. It gives us much to talk about. It gives us much to learn. And certainly, as we live in a time where, in recent decades and indeed today, religious violence is prevalent in our world, it gives us pause. May we never be among those who engage or indulge such passion into violence. May we understand that our covenant with the Holy One, our covenant of shalom, is a constraint, that it leads us to discipline the more impulsive and rash, dangerous aspects of our behavior, both as individuals and as a community. May we remember that a covenant of shalom, of wholeness, means to strive for peace, for harmony, to exercise our faith in ways that are constructive rather than destructive. So I read Pinchas as a warning, but I read Pinchas as a lesson that I think for most of history we have learned pretty well. May you have a thoughtful Shabbat. May you have a peaceful and joyous Shabbat. May you have a sense of that Brit Shalom, that covenant of shalom with God, with your loved ones, this Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.